She was dragging a green ponderosa pine log up the ridge, alone, a task that would have made two grown men curse the day they were born. The wind was already carrying that sharp, metallic scent of ozone that screams of snow, and there she was, boots slipping in the scree, fighting gravity with nothing but a fraying hemp rope and a stubborn refusal to die. It was the kind of sight that makes you pull your horse up short and wonder just what kind of desperation drives a person to build a fortress with their bare hands. Welcome back to Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of grit, survival, and the kind of romance that's forged in the fires of hardship, do us a favor, hitch your horse, smash that like button, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these stories from the Old West alive. Now let's head up to the high country, where winter is coming and time is running out. Caleb Thorne sat atop his gelding, a roan with a winter coat already thickening into a shaggy wool, watching from the tree line. It was late October, the time of year when the Rockies stop whispering warnings and start shouting them. The wind cut through his canvas duster, a bitter reminder that the first real blizzard wasn't weeks away, it was days. Down in the clearing, the woman didn't see him. She was too busy warring with the timber. The log was a full-length pine, heavy with sap, sticky and stubborn. She had the rope looped over her shoulder. Her body angled forward at a 45-degree distinct lean, and boots scrabbling for purchase in the freezing mud. Her dress, a faded calico that had probably once been blue but was now the color of trail dust, was mud-stained to the knees. It was a blow-sabella state of dress. As the town biddies would say, unkempt, wild, and entirely practical for the work at hand. Most folks, men or women, would have quit an hour ago. They would have sat down in the dirt and wept. But she just readjusted her grip, let out a sharp hiss of breath, and heaved. The log moved 3 inches, groaning against the rocky soil. Caleb nudged his horse, Shadow, down the slope. The hooves crunched on the frost-hardened ground, loud as pistol shots in the thin air. The woman heard him then. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the rope. She just straightened up, chest heaving, and whipped around. Her hand went to her belt, not to a gun but to a heavy iron hammer hanging there. She stood her ground, chin high, watching him come like he was just another wolf she'd have to drive off. "Afternoon," Caleb said, reining in about 10 yards out. He kept his hands visible, resting on the saddle horn, a universal sign of peace, in a land where shoot first was often the law. That's a lot of timber for one person. "I don't need charity," she said. Her voice was raspy, dry as old parchment, but steady. She didn't relax her grip on the hammer. "And I don't have any money for shysters or land grabbers." Caleb swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the earth with a heavy thud. He ignored her hostility and looked at the structure behind her. It was a single-pen cabin, maybe 12 by 12. The walls were barely chest-high, rough-hewn logs stacked with sheer will. There was no roof, no gables. Just an open box waiting to be filled with snow. Beside it, a canvas tent sagged miserably, smoke leaking from a pitiful fire pit. "Your corners are good," Caleb noted, nodding at the joinery. "Saddle notched. Keeps the water out better than a box corner. But that roof won't hold without proper purlins. And you need a ridgepole. Heavier than anything you got cut here." He looked up at the sky, gray and heavy like a bruised eyelid. "Storm's coming. 2 weeks, maybe less. A big one. You can smell the ice in the air." "I'll manage," she snapped. Caleb looked at her then, really looked. She was thin, the kind of thing that comes from skipping meals to buy nails. But it was her face that held him. A scar, jagged and pale, ran from her left temple all the way down to her jawline, pulling the corner of her lip slightly. It was an old burn, brutal and undeniable. The skin shiny and taut against her weathered complexion. She saw him staring. She didn't look away, but her shoulders hiked up, tense as a bowstring. "I'm not pretty," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a statement she'd probably thrown at the world 100 times to beat them to the punch. "I know what I look like. I'm a fright." Caleb met her eyes. They were gray, hard as flint. "That's fine," he said, his voice low and rough. "I am not looking for pretty. I need honest. Out here winter kills the pretty folk first. It's the honest ones that last." She blinked, the hammer lowering just an inch. It was the first time she looked confused rather than angry. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you stop?" "You don't know me from Eve." "Because I'm tired of liars and fancy dresses," Caleb said, more to himself than her. He walked over to the log she'd been dragging. He tested the weight, feeling the dense resistance of the wood. And because watching you try to lift this is making my back hurt just looking at it. He picked up the rope. You got nails? Square heads, I hope. She hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the tent. I have a crate. In the tent. But I can't pay you. Not with money. I spent my last dollar on the claim. I don't need money, Caleb said. I run cattle 3 miles south. I need my shirts mended. I'm terrible with a needle. And I need a hot meal that doesn't taste like burnt beans and loneliness. You can pay with labor. I cook, she said quickly. And I can mend. I'm fast with a needle. I can make a so-belly stew taste like a French dinner. Fair enough. Caleb nodded. Name's Caleb Thorne. Elara, she said. Elara Vance. Well, Elara Vance, Caleb said, looking at the half-finished wall. We start tomorrow at first light. You get that fire built up. If you freeze to death tonight, I'm going to be real annoyed about wasting my time talking to you. He mounted up and rode out without looking back. Elara watched him go until the pines swallowed him whole. Then, and only then, did she sit down on the stump. Her hands, which had been rock steady while he was there, began to shake violently. She touched the scar on her face. For 6 months, that scar had been a wall between her and the world. It made women cross the street and men look at her with a mix of pity and revulsion. But this cowboy, he hadn't looked at the scar. He'd looked at the work. Honest, she whispered to the empty clearing. He needs honest. The wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves of the scrub oaks. It was colder now, the temperature dropping like a stone. Elara stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She had a deal. And for the first time since the fire that had taken everything from her, she had something else too. A chance. The next afternoon, the rhythm of the camp had changed. It wasn't the desperate, scrambling noise of one person fighting the impossible. It was the steady, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of productivity. Caleb crouched by Elara's fire, a tin cup of coffee steaming in his hands. He watched her organize her tools. It wasn't a mess. It was a system. The nails, valuable square-headed. Cut nails that cost a fortune out here, were sorted by size in salvaged tin cans. The lumber was stacked with spacers to keep it dry. The hammer handle was wrapped in strips of rawhide for a smaller, firmer grip. You plan like an engineer, Caleb observed, taking a sip. The coffee was Arbuckle's, black, thick enough to float a horseshoe, and hot enough to scald the back of your throat, just the way he liked it. Most folks out here just slap wood together and pray. Taught myself, Elara said, not looking up from the cast-iron spider she was scrubbing with sand. After my husband Silas died, I had to learn or freeze. She paused, the scrubbing motion slowing. Town's got a lot of widows. Most of them just wait for the next man to come along and tell them what to do. They sit around weeping into their lace handkerchiefs. Why buy land out here? Caleb asked. This claim is 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. That's a long way to scream if trouble comes. A long way to be alone. Elara's jaw tightened. She set the pot down with a metallic clang. A merchant in town, Jedediah Crutchfield, he wanted me after Silas passed. Said a scarred woman shouldn't be picky. Said I needed a man's protection. She spat the word protection like it was a piece of gristle. He's a bottom feeder. When I refused him, the rumors started. Said I was cursed. Said I was a witch who burned her own house down to kill her husband. Caleb said nothing. He just watched the fire waiting. On the frontier, asking too many questions was a good way to get shot. You waited for the truth to be offered. The fire started during a fight. Elara continued, her voice flat, detached. Silas, he drank. He had a taste for the Who Hit John, that cheap corn whiskey. The lamp broke. I tried to pull him out. I really did. She touched her scar unconsciously, her fingers tracing the ridge of damaged skin. He hit me, shoved me back into the flames to save himself. I got free. He didn't. She looked up, her eyes defying Caleb to judge her. The town buried him as a hero. They buried me alive with their gossip. So I took what little money I had and bought this claim. Figured if I'm going to be alone, I might as well be on my own terms. No more answering to drunks or merchants. Caleb nodded slowly. He set his cup down on a flat stone. Honest terms. And you? Elara asked, turning the tables. A ranch your size? People talk. You should have a wife. Sons to take over the brand. A man like you shouldn't be botching it. Caleb let out a short, humorless laugh. Had a wife, Sarah. She was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that made men stop talking when she walked into a room. She was all lace and manners. He picked up a pine stick and poked at the embers. She wanted the town life. Dances, parties, imported silk. She hated the ranch. Hated the smell of cattle, the mud, and the silence. She called the silence dreadful. He paused, the memory clearly bitter. She died 2 years back, childbirth. The baby didn't make it either. "I'm sorry," Elara said softly. "Don't be." Caleb stood up, brushing ash from his knees. "I loved her, I think. Once. But I didn't like her much toward the end. And she surely didn't like me. We were just two people trapped in the same house, making each other miserable." He looked out toward the ridge, where his cattle were grazing in the distance. When she passed, my first thought wasn't grief. It was relief, and I've hated myself for that ever since. Elara looked at him, surprised by the admission. "That doesn't make you a monster, Caleb. It makes you human." "Maybe," Caleb grunted. "But the town widows. They started circling like buzzards the day after the funeral, bringing casseroles, asking about my linens, all performance. They want to be Mrs. Thorne. They want the ranch, the name, the status. They don't want me, and they certainly don't want to help pull a calf out of a mud bog in a rainstorm." Elara stood too, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at him with a new understanding. "So this arrangement," she said, gesturing between them. "It's practical. You need help avoiding the buzzards. You need to look busy. I need a roof before the snow." "Exactly," Caleb said. "I need meals and mending. You need muscle and lumber. Nobody needs to make it complicated with feelings or courtship. I'm not looking to spark anyone." "Agreed." Elara extended her hand. "Just honest work." They shook. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her palm calloused and rough. It matched his own. He noticed she didn't flinch when his skin touched hers. There was no electricity, no swooning, just the solid, reassuring pressure of a contract being struck. "We'll start on the roof frame tomorrow," Caleb said, turning toward his horse. "I'll bring the team to haul the ridge pole. You have that coffee ready?" Elara watched him ride off. The sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood reds. For the first time in months, the tightening in her chest eased. It wasn't happiness. That was too dangerous a word for a woman like her. But it was relief. She turned back to her cabin. It was still just a shell, but now it had a future. And so maybe did she. 1 week later, the world turned white. It didn't start with a whimper. It started with a sky that turned the color of a bruised plum, followed by a wind that screamed down the canyon like a banshee. The air smelled sharp, ozone and ice, crisp enough to burn the lungs. By noon, the snow was falling so thick you couldn't see the tree line. Flakes driving in at a 45-degree angle, hard as birdshot. Elara stood on the ladder, holding a heavy pine board steady while Caleb hammered it into place. The roof was just a skeleton of beams, covered now by a heavy canvas tarp Caleb had brought up from his wagon. It flapped violently in the wind, cracking like a bullwhip. "Hold it steady!" Caleb yelled over the gale. "I'm trying." Elara shouted back, her knuckles white against the rough wood. "The wind wants it more than I do." They worked in a frenzy, racing the weather. The temperature plummeted, stealing the heat from their bodies. Caleb's breath puffed out in thick white clouds that froze in his beard. Finally, the last nail, a bent, stubborn thing, was driven home. The tarp was secured, weighed down with heavy river stones and lashed tight with rawhide. It wasn't a finished roof, but it was shelter. "Get inside!" Caleb grabbed her arm, guiding her off the ladder as the wind threatened to knock them both into the drifts. They stumbled into the cabin. It was dark, illuminated only by the flickering fire in the corner hearth. The wind howled outside, battering the logs. But the walls they had built together, saddle-notched and chinked with mud, held firm. The sudden silence inside was almost deafening. "Too late for me to ride back," Caleb said, brushing snow from his coat. His face was red, wind-burned. "If I go out in that, I'll be frozen in the saddle before I hit the creek. My horse, Shadow, he's sheltered in the lean-to. But I am not making him walk in this." Elara nodded, her face pale in the firelight. She looked around the small, intimate space. "You're staying." I only have one blanket, but we have the fire." "We'll manage," Caleb said, his voice low. He looked at the single bedroll. "I'll sleep by the hearth." That night, the storm raged with a fury that shook the ground. But inside, there was a strange, suspended quiet. The air smelled of pine resin, wet wool, and wood smoke. Elara moved to the fire, using tongs to pull several smooth river stones from the edge of the coals. She wrapped them in thick flannel cloths. "Here," she said, handing one to Caleb. "Put this in your coat. It'll hold the heat for hours." My grandmother taught me. Poor man's hot water bottle. Caleb took the warm bundle, surprised. Thank you. They sat by the fire, sharing the single wool blanket draped over both their shoulders. They weren't touching, not really. But the heat of his body radiated against her arm, a solid anchoring presence. The cabin felt smaller with him in it, but not crowded, just full. Elara reached into her pack and pulled out a book. It was water-stained, the cover peeling, but it was treated like Holy Writ. "Do you read?" she asked. Caleb stared at the book. He looked down at his hands, large, scarred, capable of building a house but useless with a pen. "Barely," he admitted, shame coloring his tone. "Never had much time for schooling. Cows don't care if you can spell. I can read a cattle brand and a bill of sale, but that's about the size of it. I could read to you," she offered. "If you want. It passes the time better than listening to the wind." "I'd like that." She opened the book. It was Homer's Odyssey. She began to read, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the noise of the storm. She read of Odysseus facing the Cyclops, of the long, brutal journey home. She read of Penelope, the wife who waited, weaving her shroud by day and unpicking it by night to keep the suitors at bay. Caleb listened like a starving man given a feast. He watched her lips move, shaping the ancient words. He watched the firelight dance on her scar, turning the jagged line into something that looked like a lightning strike. Powerful. Dangerous. "That Penelope," Caleb interrupted softly. "She's smart. Tricking those men, keeping the wolves at the door." "She had to be," Elara said, lowering the book. She was a woman alone in a house full of men who wanted to take everything she had. She used what weapons she had. Her mind, her loom. Caleb looked at her, the connection snapping into place. "Like you, with your hammer, and your thinking." "Like me," she whispered. The wind shrieked, a high, lonely sound. Caleb shifted and his shoulder brushed hers. This time, neither of them pulled away. The warmth of the stones in their laps mingled with the warmth between them. "My wife, Sarah," Caleb said, his voice rough. "She never read to me. She said books were for people who didn't have to work. She made me feel fiddle-headed, stupid for not knowing things." "You know things she never did?" Elara said fiercely. "You know how to build a wall that stands against this wind. You know how to keep a fire alive when the wood is wet. That's not stupid, Caleb, that's survival. And out here, survival is the only intelligence that matters." Caleb looked at her, stunned. For 2 years, he had carried the weight of his own inadequacy. And in 2 sentences, this scarred woman in a half-finished cabin had lifted it off his shoulders. "Read some more," he said, his voice thick. "Please." She read until her voice grew hoarse. Somewhere around midnight, exhausted by the labor and the cold, Elara's head drooped. She fell asleep, her cheek coming to rest against Caleb's shoulder. He went perfectly still. He was terrified to move, terrified to wake her. He sat there, staring into the dying fire, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. The storm was tearing the world apart outside, burying the landscape in white, but in here, for the first time in a long time, Caleb Thorne felt completely at peace. He was warm, and he wasn't alone. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of pristine, blinding white powder. The sun fractured off the snow, creating a glare that made your eyes ache. It was a blue-belly sky, clear, cold, and indifferent. They separated awkwardly at dawn, the intimacy of the night before hanging in the air like smoke. Caleb stepped outside to check the chimney, grateful for the biting cold to cool the heat in his face. Then he froze. Around the cabin, perfectly preserved in the fresh drift, were horse tracks. They weren't his. Someone had ridden up during the storm, circled the cabin, and ridden off. Someone had been watching. "What is it?" Elara asked from the doorway, clutching her shawl tight. "Riders," Caleb said grimly. "Last night, we weren't as alone as we thought. Someone was prowling. 2 weeks passed." The cabin was finished. The door was hung on heavy iron hinges, the windows sealed with oilcloth until glass could be bought. They fell into a domestic rhythm that terrified Caleb more than any stampede. He taught her to braid rope. She taught him the words in Shakespeare. They were building a life, board by board, word by word, but the world wouldn't let them be. It was the week before Christmas when they rode into Elkridge for supplies. The town was bustling, cutters and sleighs moving through the slushy streets. The air smelled of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, a stark contrast to the clean pine scent of the high country. Elara sat tall on the wagon seat beside him, her scar exposed to the cold sunlight. She refused to hide. They pulled up to the mercantile. The moment their boots hit the boardwalk, the conversation on the porch died. It was that heavy, suffocating silence that screams louder than shouting. Standing there was Reverend Josiah Black, flanked by 3 church elders and smirking in the back, the merchant Jedediah Crutchfield.
"Brother Thorne!"
The Reverend boomed, his voice carrying to every ear on Main Street. "We were surprised to see you. We heard you've been spending your nights occupied." Caleb stiffened. He felt the eyes of the town on him, the big mouths, and the gossips who had nothing better to do than tear folks down. "I've been working, Reverend, helping a neighbor get a roof up before winter. Just neighborly. Is that what we call it now?" Crutchfield stepped forward, his oily smile in place. He looked like a man who had never done a day of honest labor in his life, a dude, in a fancy suit, working. "My ranch hand saw your horses stabled together during the storm. Saw the lamplight, saw the shadows." The crowd gathered, pressing in. Women clutched their children, whispering behind gloved hands. "That's her!" they hissed. The burned woman. The witch. She's bewitched him. "This woman is known for sin," the Reverend intoned, pointing a finger at Elara like a weapon. "She carries the mark of God's judgment on her face. You defile yourself, Jacob, and you defile the memory of your late wife by keeping company with such refuse. You are waking up the wrong passenger, son." Elara didn't shrink. She stood taller, though Caleb saw her hand trembling at her side. She looked at Caleb, waiting for him to speak the truth, to say, "She saved me. We saved each other," to acknowledge the corn and tell them all to go to hell. But Caleb looked at the faces of the town, the people he had known his whole life. He saw their judgment, their disgust, and the old fear, the fear that had made him stay in a loveless marriage for years to keep up appearances, seized his throat. He felt like a fiddle-headed fool. "It's just work," Caleb said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. He didn't look at Elara. "The cabin's nearly done. I was just hired help. Nothing more. It was a business arrangement." The words hung in the frozen air, sharper than the wind. Elara went rigid. The color drained from her face, making the scar stand out like a fresh wound. Just work. He had taken the nights of reading, the shared laughter, and the moment of absolute trust during the storm, and reduced it to a transaction. He had made her a charity case again. "See?" Crutchfield laughed, turning to Elara. "Even he knows you're not worth defending, my dear. My offer still stands. Honest work at my boarding house. Better than starving in a shanty. Come work for me, and we'll forget this little indiscretion." Elara turned to Caleb. Her eyes weren't angry. They were dead. "The cabin is finished, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice ice-cold. "Our contract is done." She turned and walked away through the snow, past the staring crowd. She didn't run. She walked with the dignity of a queen marching to the gallows. She didn't absquatulate in shame. She retreated with honor. Caleb stood there, the town's approval washing over him like sewage. The Reverend clapped him on the shoulder. "Good man, Caleb. Best not to get mixed up with her kind. You dodged a bullet there, by gum." Caleb pulled away, feeling sick. He climbed back into his wagon. The seat beside him was empty. The drive back to his ranch was the longest, coldest journey of his life. He had saved his reputation. He had escaped by the skin of his teeth, and in doing so, he had destroyed the only honest thing he had ever found. Christmas week arrived, bringing a cold that snapped tree limbs like glass. It was a blue norther, the kind of cold that freezes your breath before it leaves your mouth. Caleb sat alone in his ranch house. It was a fine house, 2 stories, glass windows, a hearth big enough to roast a steer, but it felt as empty as a tomb. He had a bottle of whiskey on the table. Who hit John? The strong stuff. It was the same bottle he'd opened the night he came back from town. It was untouched. He knew whiskey wouldn't burn away the shame sitting in his gut. He stared out the frosted window toward the hill where Sarah was buried. For years he had apologized to that grave. Apologized for not being enough. Apologized for surviving. But now, looking at the cold marble, he realized he had nothing left to say to the dead. He was tired of living with ghosts. 3 miles away, in a cabin that smelled of fresh pine and resilience, Elara worked. She was finishing the interior chinking, daubing the mix of clay and lime into the cracks between the logs. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was numb. She should have known better. That was the refrain beating in her head. Hope is dangerous. She had let herself believe, just for a moment, that she could be seen as something other than a scar. Caleb had proven her wrong. He was just like Silas. Just like Crutchfield, men who used women to bolster their own comfort or reputation. She was a featherhead for thinking otherwise. On Christmas morning, Elara woke to a sound at her door. She grabbed her hammer, old habits die hard, and cracked it open. There was no one there. But on the rough-hewn steps sat a block of ice. Inside the ice, perfectly preserved, was a cluster of purple wildflowers, early crocuses that must have been dug up from beneath the snow in some sheltered hollow, or maybe found near a hot spring. They were suspended in the frozen water, vibrant and alive in the dead of winter. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Only one man knew she loved wildflowers. Only one man knew she needed color in this gray world. Elara carried the ice block inside and set it on the table. She watched it slowly melt near the fire, the water dripping onto the wood like tears. She didn't cry. She just stared at the flowers, feeling the wall around her heart develop a hairline fracture. That afternoon, old Samuel rode up to Caleb's porch. Samuel was 70, tough as boiled leather, a man who had been in the valley before there was a town. He didn't dismount. He just sat on his mule, chewing on a piece of straw. "You look like hell, Caleb," Samuel grunted. "You look like death eating a cracker." "Feel worse," Caleb admitted, leaning against the porch rail. "Good." Samuel spat into the snow. "I heard what happened in town. Heard you stood there and let them preachers spit on that woman. The woman who dragged logs up a mountain while you were sitting on your horse. That's downright insulting, son." Caleb flinched. "I panicked, Samuel. They were circling her." "They were circling you," Samuel corrected. "And you folded. You choked the horn when you should have rode the bull, your wife. She wanted pretty, Caleb. She wanted the fancy life. And you broke your back trying to give it to her. Now you found someone real, someone who builds her own damn roof, and you're too scared of a little gossip to claim it." "She told me not to come back," Caleb said quietly. "She closed the door. She called the contract done." "Then kick it down," Samuel barked. "Or stand outside it until she opens it. But don't sit here feeling sorry for yourself. You got a choice, son. You can be respected by a town full of hypocrites, or you can be loved by a woman who knows what honest work is. You can't have both." Samuel turned his mule. "Winter's long, Caleb. It's a hell of a lot longer when you're sleeping alone in a house full of ghosts. You keep this up, you'll end up the spout, ruined and alone." Caleb watched him ride away. He looked back at the whiskey bottle. Then he grabbed it by the neck and hurled it into the fireplace. It shattered, the alcohol flaring up in a burst of blue flame. "I'm done," Caleb said to the empty room. "I'm done with fancy. And I'm done with being a coward." He grabbed his coat, his heavy buffalo coat. He didn't saddle his horse. He walked. He walked the 3 miles through the snow, punishing himself with every step, rehearsing the words he had been too afraid to say in front of the mercantile. He walked until his lungs burned, until the cold stripped away everything but the truth. Caleb didn't go to Elara's cabin first. On Sunday morning, he walked into the church in Elkridge. He marched down the aisle, boots clumping on the pine floor, interrupting Reverend Black mid-sermon. He stood at the pulpit, hat in his hands, facing the rows of shocked faces. "I'm here to confess," Caleb said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. "I'm here to set the record straight about Elara Vance." He looked directly at Jedediah Crutchfield. "I told you all it was just work." "That was a lie. It was the best work of my life. That woman built a home from ash while you people sat here and threw stones. She has more honor in her little finger than this whole town has in its bank accounts." He took a breath, looking at the women who had whispered about him. "I said I was just hired help. The truth is, she saved me. She saved me from becoming bitter. She saved me from being lonely. And I repaid her with cowardice. I acted like a dude, worrying about my reputation instead of a man worrying about what's right." He put his hat back on. "If you want to judge someone, judge me. But stay the hell away from her unless you're coming to help. I'm going to raise her barn, alone if I have to." He walked out. 2 hours later, Elara was on her roof, hammering the final shingles. She was determined to finish it alone. She heard the hoofbeats but didn't look up. She assumed it was Crutchfield coming to gloat. Then she saw the wagons. It wasn't just Caleb. Behind him, a procession of wagons struggled through the snow. It was the town. Not all of them. Crutchfield was absent, hiding in his store, but enough. There were the millers, the blacksmith, and the families who had silently watched on the boardwalk. They carried lumber. They carried food baskets. They carried guilt. Caleb rode to the front. He dismounted and walked to the ladder. He didn't ask permission. He climbed up until he was eye level with her boots. "I told them," he said, breathless. "I told them everything. I told them you're worth 10 of them. I told them I was a fool." Elara looked down at him, the hammer heavy in her hand. "Words are wind, Caleb. Words don't keep the snow out." "I know," he said. "That's why I brought lumber. We're here to build your barn, Elara. Our barn, if you'll have me." She looked past him at the people unloading wagons. She saw women setting up tables for food, venison stew and cornbread. She saw men rolling up their sleeves, axes in hand. It was an apology written in sweat and timber. It was a hog-killing time, a celebration of work. "You're a fool, Caleb Thorne," she said, her voice trembling. "I am," he agreed. "But I'm an honest one. And I'm asking for a partnership. Equal share, equal say, no more hiding, no more fancy." She studied his face, the weathering around his eyes, the earnest tilt of his mouth. She reached down and took his hand. "Deal." The barn raising took 3 days. It was a celebration of noise, saws singing, hammers beating a rhythm, laughter rising like smoke. When the frame was up, strong and true, the town left them. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it was glorious. The snow retreated, revealing the black, fertile earth. Elara and Caleb sat on the porch of the finished cabin. The garden was planted, rows of potatoes and beans bordered by wild purple crocuses. Caleb reached over and took her hand. He traced the scar on her cheek with his thumb. "You know," he said softly, "you're beautiful." Elara smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I'm scarred, Caleb." "Same thing," he said. "Just shows you survived the fire. Shows you're real." He looked out at the mountains, ancient and patient against the blue sky. "Pretty fades like summer paint," he murmured, quoting the thought he'd had the day they met. "Fancy breaks under the winter wind. But honest builds a life that holds." Elara rested her head on his shoulder. "Read to me?" she asked. Caleb picked up the worn copy of the Odyssey. He opened it to the end, where the king finally comes home. He began to read, his voice steady and sure. "And that, folks, is how you build a life out here on the frontier. One log, one truth, and one honest moment at a time." If you enjoyed this story of Caleb and Elara, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We've got plenty more tales from the rescue files coming your way. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart honest.